We're really fortunate to have Ben Cahill with us here today, a real expert in this. When I want to find out what's going on, I either read what he's written or if he has time, give him a call, and he does always have time. Ben is a senior fellow with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and we've been Ben and CSIS have been generous enough to, as we talked about earlier, host a great stakeholder session in Washington, and so I can't wait to hear you make all the EU regulatory developments seem clear to us, Ben.
Man, that's not going to happen, but I'll try. Well, thanks a lot, Bob, and it's great to see everyone today. I'm really surprised, but pleased that there are so many people in the room. The army of methane nerds keeps getting bigger all the time, so it's great to see. So I want to introduce where we are with the European proposed methane legislation, talk about some of the outstanding issues, put it into context and why it matters, and maybe try to connect it to what is the implication for the global gas and LNG market. But first, why look at EU methane legislation? This is not a major oil and gas producing region, right? And keep in mind that the North Sea doesn't count. So Norway and the UK are not EU 27 members, so they're not covered by domestic legislation. Aside from Romania, there really aren't significant oil and gas producers within the European Union. But there are a couple of reasons why I think it's important to look at this legislation. First, methane is high up on the international agenda before COP28, as Claire and Tom just mentioned. There's a real race to finalize rules, both in the United States and in the EU. The so-called trilogue process is underway. I'll talk about what that means and what's happening now. But there is a tension between different voices within the European Union on what to do on methane and how aggressive to be right now. And that's playing out in real time. So it's kind of a window on policymakers grappling with methane policy on the oil and gas sector around the world. There's a lot of cooperation between the US and the EU on methane, as you just heard. I spent about 9 months doing research trying to talk about how these pieces of the puzzle fit together. For example, with new EPA regulations on the oil and gas industry, new EPA reporting requirements under Subpart W, how far will that go towards meeting European demands? I still don't know, but I think that's an important question. So these efforts are happening in parallel, but they're very much linked. And there's just a different regulatory approach in the United States and the EU, so it's important to contrast them. But I think the key here is the question of the methane import standard. And this is where what happens in Europe touches the rest of the world. The theory of change in the EU is that it doesn't really matter what these countries do on domestic oil and gas regulation. What really matters is how they purchase gas. So the EU imports more than 90% of its natural gas, more than 80% of its fossil fuels. And there's always been this prevailing view in the EU that the best way for them to influence methane reductions from the oil and gas industry is to drive down emissions associated with all the gas they purchase. And to them, that's the biggest lever of influence. They're one of the biggest gas purchasing regions in the world. And so there's a real desire to exercise that leverage in the global gas market and create a ripple effect through the system. So that's why it's seen as critically important. So a brief timeline, the European Union introduced its methane strategy in late 2020. The European Commission then introduced what's called a legislative proposal in 2021. So I'm getting into perilous waters here as an American trying to describe European legislative processes. I'm sure there are Europeans in the audience, so if I get something wrong, just give me a dirty look or talk to me afterwards. But the key here is that there's 3 legislative bodies. There's the European Commission, which is the executive branch of the EU. There's the European Parliament. You've probably seen pictures of the big hall with 700 representatives in the semicircle. And then there's the Council of the European Union, or the Council. That's the member states. It's made up of ministers. These are co-legislators. They all have to agree on legislation. Typically, the way it works is that the European Commission tables a legislative proposal, and the other bodies consider it. They talk about it. They can either adopt it or they can suggest changes. And so the timeline here is that the European Commission introduced its legislative proposal at the end of 2021, and then there was a long delay. A couple things happened in energy, right? We had this dramatic run up in natural gas and electricity prices in Europe. That started in mid to late 2021, well before the Russia-Ukraine war. Then the war happened. And so, methane legislation was slowed down a lot by this. The reality is that the EU was grappling with a huge number of energy challenges. And so methane legislation just slipped down the agenda. But the Council issued its general agreement or its version of legislation in December of 2022. And then this May, the European Parliament introduced its proposal. So I'm not going to go over all three because there's too much detail, but I will talk about significant differences. They're being hashed out right now. What's happening is the so-called trilogue negotiation. This is when the three bodies come together and try to agree on a joint text. And that's happening as we speak. There's a really strong desire to get this done before COP28, which means we only have a couple weeks to do it. We're talking about the next month. So what are the areas of agreement or convergence? Everyone across these institutions agrees that Europe needs to collect more information about the emissions intensity and the methane intensity of the gas that it buys, both through pipelines and LNG. And so what the Commission proposed is gathering all this data to put together what they call a methane supply index. What that means is that if you're an importer into the EU, say a gas utility that buys a lot of gas, you have to go out and ask your suppliers certain things. So are they undertaking measurement, reporting, and verification? Do they report per UN FCCC guidelines or OGMP 2.0 reporting tiers? They have to provide a copy of their methane emissions data from the last year. They have to describe how they've done quantification, for example, if it's aligning with an OGMP level. And they have to provide notes about their LDAR practices, the frequency of surveys that they use, the measures that they're implementing to control venting and flaring. So all this is pretty extensive. And right now, basically none of their suppliers give them this stuff. So this is all new. That on its own, I think, is pretty significant. And that is kind of a common thread throughout all these bodies. There are some areas of disagreement or negotiation, though. On flaring and venting rules, everyone in each of the three institutions wants to introduce a ban on routine flaring. But the standards vary a little bit. So the Parliament wants a 99% destruction efficiency for flaring, which is pretty stringent. Council is 98%. This is not far off from the suggested EPA requirements in the proposed rule. An area where there's a lot of difference, and I think they're going to negotiate, is through leak detection and repair. And here there's kind of a philosophical difference happening, I think, between different parties in Europe. Basically, the Commission said you have to do a survey every 3 months of all the equipment, full stop. And a lot of people thought that was too onerous. The Council went back, and again, this is the voice of the member states. So think of this as a consensus building among 27 countries with very different views. The Council said, okay, we don't want to do this prescriptive process, survey every 3 months for every piece of kit. Instead, we're going to really focus on where we know the large emissions events happen. And we'll make you do more frequent surveys of those things or surveys with much more higher detection threshold. And so, frankly, they watered down the proposal, but they strengthened it in certain areas that they thought were quite important. And that was controversial. There was very strong pushback, particularly in the European Parliament. You saw a lot of people who thought that that was too friendly to the oil and gas industry, and they wanted to go much farther. So there's been a lot of debate and discussion about that. The big one is the import standard. And I want to spend a couple minutes talking about this because I think it's really the critical issue. So in May, the Parliament issued its own approved text or its own version of this methane legislation. And what they want to do is introduce a binding 2030 methane reduction target for the oil and gas industry, for coal, and for biomethane. Every country would have to submit a methane reduction target by 2025, end of 2025, and a national reduction plan. And the critical thing is, by January 1st of 2026, what the Parliament wants is for every supplier of gas in the EU to basically meet the same standards as all the European companies. So that means if you're selling pipeline volumes or LNG into the European Union, you have to meet the same LDAR requirements, the same flaring and venting requirements, the same reporting stringency, all the stuff that European companies have to do. That's January 1st of 2026, which is really right around the corner, right? And so I think this is the critical issue that's being debated now within the European Union. Why does this matter? Again, the theory of change in Europe is that by setting these rules, they can kind of force the whole global oil and gas industry to do better, to do hard things, to adjust, to put the pieces in place, to monitor, report, and verify emissions throughout their whole value chain, and then provide that data. And if you don't do that, you're either looking at potentially a penalty, you'll have to pay a fee to sell into Europe, or eventually maybe the market might be closed to you altogether. So all these things are very much up for debate right now. I would say that a lot of environmental NGOs are very much in favor of a firm methane import standard by 2026. And what they argue is, look, we've already waited too long. We lost 18 months during the Russia-Ukraine war. This slipped down the agenda. If we don't have this rule in place by 2026, how are we going to make the progress that we need between now and the end of the decade? So that's the case being made, I think, in a very vociferous way. But the reality is it's clashing with price and energy security concerns among a lot of these European countries. A lot of them think that, frankly, they don't have the luxury of collecting all this data and applying these standards to all their gas suppliers. They're worried about shortages in the winter. I mean, we're in pretty good shape heading into this winter, but there was really acute concern about energy security and price for the last year and a half. So I think among some of the member states, they're worried about introducing the standard by 2026. So the trilogue is happening now. The methane import standard is a big focus of discussion. I can't tell you exactly how it's going to end up. I read a report in Reuters the other day that the French government has proposed kind of a compromise solution. Maybe we'll introduce an interim target. So by 2026, 70% of gas supplies in Europe might have to meet this standard, moving to 100% by the year 2029. Maybe something like that will gain traction. I don't know, but that's it's sort of a middle ground approach. But at minimum, the significance is if you're a global gas and LNG player, whether it's Cheniere or Qatar Energy or an Australian LNG provider, you have to pay attention to what these rules will be in Brussels, because it sets the tone. The hope in Europe is that by setting this import standard, they can really activate other countries' regulators, the financial sector, investors, and say, look, this is possible. We should be pushing the oil and gas industry to accomplish these things by 2026. But it's a big ask. And I think if you talk with most people in the industry, they'll say, the idea of us putting all these things into place by January 1st of 2026 is a big challenge. I will note, just from my research and from talking with a lot of people on both sides of the Atlantic about methane regulations, there is a kind of a difference in approach between the US and Europe about these things. In the US, think of the EPA. The EPA puts out proposed rule. There's a really extensive comment and review period. They get thousands of comments, hundreds of thousands of comments in the case of the EPA proposed regulations. They take those on board. They want to make it as ironclad as possible to protect it from lawsuits, right? Like, a lot of energy policy in this country happens through the legal system. It's through lawsuits, tax policy and lawsuits. That's how we do energy policy here. In Europe, it's different. Even though these are really complicated technical rules, they're often made without industry at the table, without really listening to the industry. And I think with things like leak detection and repair surveys, the ability to meet methane quantification standards that could be part of a methane import standard, from my perspective, it's really challenging to do these things without letting industry in a little bit earlier and talking about what's possible. Because I think even the most well-intentioned gas and LNG suppliers, the ones who are most active in trying to capture and quantify their emissions and even do this across value chains, they'll tell you it's pretty darn hard to do this stuff, and a 2-year timeline is tough. So maybe I'll stop there and just leave time for conversation.
That was outstanding. Really great, Ben. Thank you. Thank you. We have a couple, we didn't plan this as a moderated discussion, but if we had a question come in, and just a quick observation, Arvind, as he was talking about those changes in the LDAR standards and so on, I found, wouldn't it be cool, this is not suggesting a project, but if you could apply something like the FEAST model to try to understand what the differences would be between those different approaches.
That's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up. The European proposed legislation is much more prescriptive than the EPA approach, I think. The whole idea of the FEAST model is that innovation is happening so fast in methane detection and technology that you want to create a regulatory system that can accommodate this. And I know Arvind talked about the FEAST model today. I talked about that a little bit with people in the EU, and they almost seemed a little bit jealous of this. They thought that was a pretty smart approach. The EU regulations, the proposed ones, are much more prescriptive. And if you look at some of the requirements for leak detection and repair surveys, they're really hard to meet, particularly with the Parliament proposal. The detection threshold is extremely difficult, if not impossible to meet.
Interesting.
And that's an area that's gotten a lot of pushback from industry associations.
Aaron, do we have a quick question? We
have a couple of, maybe 2 themes that seem really popular, if you can take 2. So maybe the simpler one, is Europe thinking about imported gas from the specific collection of suppliers that, like, at that cargo level, or are they thinking about it like the region of origin? Do you have a sense of how they're thinking about imported gas?
Yeah, I mean, I think that here you almost have to break out pipeline and LNG suppliers. And the challenges in the United States are quite different from other countries. So as you all know, with LNG exports from the United States, the LNG exporters often don't produce the gas, right? They have no title over the gas. They're not involved in upstream production. They don't have a stake in the midstream either. They own the liquefaction facilities and then they export it, right? In other countries, like in Qatar, for example, you'll have one national oil company that's involved in every link of the value chain. So production, gathering and boosting, liquefaction, even shipping. These guys own the tankers as well. So it's a lot easier for them to join up the bits of data from all those links in the supply chain. In the United States, it's much more challenging. The way this comes into the proposed legislation, one thing that's worth noting, it's quite interesting, there's a proposal for what's called a derogation, which basically means that the European Commission could make a determination that if a country has rules in place that are either as stringent or more stringent than the EU rules, that they could be kind of exempt from this. In my layman's read on this, I'm not a lawyer, but that derogation, I think, was mostly aimed at the United States, because there's really no other country that can meet or surpass what the EU is proposing, I think, besides the United States. The last thing I'll note, when you think about suppliers to the EU, you have to think about the response from suppliers to something like this. Think about Algeria. Algeria has a state gas company, Sonatrach, which is a bit of a black box. No one knows what makes this company move and behave the way it does. It's not very transparent. It plays a really critical role in the national economy, in government revenues, export revenues, in employment, in energy security. They have to be really careful about what they do. And it's not a very open system. So if you're going to tell countries like Algeria, not only do you have to give us data, but we have all these independent third-party verifiers, and we want you to open the books and meet with them, and can they come down to Algiers and see you? Forget it. They're not going to do it. I mean, or at least they're going to push back in a big way. So I think it's important to consider country by country, which ones will be equipped to do this, which ones will be willing to do it. And as we talked about in the last panel, there's a lot of capacity building and learning and hand-holding that has to happen. That could be technical workshops, it could be technical support and assistance, it could be learning partnerships and communities of practice like OGMP 2.0 is doing. And some countries are going to need financial assistance too. Even the ones that are committed to doing something on methane reductions and make big reduction targets and promises, and there are a lot, they still need help because they don't have the kind of depth of capacity to do these things that we have in the United States. So there's a lot to do on that front.
The other is kind of a theme of questions that I'm really excited to ask you about in particular. You would literally be the person I would call to ask these questions of, even not in this crowded room. But there are a series of questions really about timing. So starting from, is this realistic right now? Is there really a scenario where Europe today declines gas that they perceive to have too high of a methane intensity from any source that they think they need it from? And kind of into the future, so can they afford to be picky now, I guess is one wording of one of the questions. And then as the supply evolves over time, what does that look like? And ultimately, how does that play out kind of in the long run? The tension between energy security really and emissions, I guess. What is that relative priority to Europe, and how does that look like in the market? Yeah,
I mean, after everything that happened from late 2021 on, I think you'd have to look at this situation and conclude Europe doesn't really have a whole lot of latitude. Like, they can't afford to be very picky right now. But the whole idea of the Commission's methane supply index is that they have to arm themselves with all the data they need about the emissions intensity of the gas they purchase from country X, Y, and Z. So that in the future, if they're in a better position to impose a more stringent import standard, or maybe introduce a fee rather than close off market access, they can do it. You don't have to jump to just closing off market access to different suppliers. What you could do is say, well, we're asking for all this data and you haven't provided any of it, so we're just going to put you in the worst bucket and we'll charge you a fee for that. That's the idea on the table from some people. So it's not necessarily an extreme position, right? I think that some of the more aggressive timelines for introducing the methane import standard, they probably can't be met. And so there will have to be a lot of exceptions allowed. For example, if you had that derogation for the United States and all US LNG suppliers are exempt, like, that's a pretty big exception, right? I expect that if we have a really firm import standard, there'll probably be a lot of loopholes. So I'm not sure that it brings you that much farther towards the outcome that we all want, which is driving down emissions associated with global gas as fast as possible, relative to just collecting the data now. But we'll see. Again, there's a lot of debate on this issue.
Thank you again, Ben. A very clear explanation of a very complicated subject. Thank you. Thank you.